morning and welcome to Morning Movie News, where yesterday we had a bit of a rare occurrence in that there wasn't any comic book movie news to discuss. We still had a great time though talking about other major Hollywood news stories, but still, I know how many of you enjoy your comic book movie news in the morning. So I told you don't be sad, for tomorrow surely more comic book movie news stories will break. Well, tomorrow is today, and I couldn't have predicted how right I would be, because today is one of the biggest days in the history of comic book movie news. Of course, I'm talking about the announcement that Spider-Man will finally swing into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But that story is so big that I think that it warrants its own episode over on the main Beyond the Trailer channel, which is up right now. So I hope you'll swing over there and check that out, as it's a full almost 20-minute discussion about, quite frankly, a game-changing deal between Sony and Disney Marvel. But there's so much comic book movie news actually today that I can still fill today's regular episode of Morning Movie News. So let's begin. Now, ironically, we're going to have the first two stories be about another Marvel property which is still flying solo, and that's the X-Men over at Fox. Very interesting indeed to be discussing them this morning, as such a big deal is happening without them. They're like, fine, Sony and Marvel Disney, be best friends. We don't care. Our X-Men movies are kicking butt. And they are. And now there are two big developments which we're going to talk about this morning. Now, the first one is about something that Bryan Singer put up on Instagram. He took a picture in front of the classic X-Men door, which he helped make famous with the X-Men movies, which has for so long led to Cerebro. And he said it with his picture. The text that accompanied it was, "Yes, I know, old door, but there's something new behind it." Now, he could be just being mean, and there's just a new version of Cerebro back there, but I don't think that's really worth a tease. And I think what many people are guessing and hoping is that we'll finally get our Danger Room sequence. They can have more than one door like that at the Xavier Institute, right? Maybe that's just the kind of doors they use. So build another one, stick it at the other end of the hall. They had a sort of a Danger Room sequence, like an old school low-key one in X-Men First Class, as you might recall, with Havoc. But for a while now, we've been hearing rumors and discussion that Singer really wants to do a hardcore Danger Room sequence. And I actually think that this is going to happen, and that he's already kind of done a test run, used it to convince Fox to give him the money to do a Danger Room sequence here. Now, what am I talking about? Well, if you take a look at X-Men Days of Future Past, when you look at the future sequences where everyone keeps dying as they fight those Super Sentinels, those are really kind of like Danger Room sequences, right? Everyone's high stakes. You see the team working together to fight a really big enemy, but then you can just hit reboot, right? It doesn't actually make a difference in the big scheme of things. It's just a chance to have the characters show off their skills and, again, their teamwork. A very important part of the X-Men comic book, and I believe also the cinematic universe, showing the X-Men work together. That's something the movies have been missing for a little bit of time. They tried to do the fastball special in the X3, but X-Men: The Last Stand, but that's really like a low-key, low-budget X-Men team-up. One of the things I think that X-Men fans like so much about Days of Future Past, and I certainly did, was seeing the X-Men finally use their powers together. It's something that's so great to see in the comics, and it was realized so beautifully on screen, with Blink setting her teammates up for these perfect blows to the Super Sentinel. It never really ended up working out, right? But it was cool to watch. So I would believe that Bryan Singer said, well, people really enjoyed those sequences. It allowed me to use mutants and show off their powers without having to develop their characters, because they weren't really a part of the story. And I'd like to do that in X-Men Apocalypse, but the only way I'm going to be able to do that is if you allow me a Danger Room sequence, because we're not time jumping anymore. We might be, though. We'll discuss that with the second story. But that's what I would think his pitch would be to Fox in the room, to get the money and the go-ahead to add that to X-Men Apocalypse, and I think it's a great idea. I think that those sequences are not only fun to watch, they make for great elements to put in the trailer, and I think it'll get more mutants on the big screen, and their powers realized in a really great way. Again, I loved those sequences, and I think they really were, we'll find they were the precursor to Danger Room sequences in X-Men Apocalypse. So I'm curious what you guys think of that. Do you think my theory is correct? And do you think that you're excited to finally see the Danger Room be done, or do you think Hollywood still isn't at the point where they can do a great Danger Room sequence? All right, so that's the first story of the day. Now, I promised you more X-Men news. I said both of the first stories were about the X-Men, but they're not both about X-Men Apocalypse. Well, maybe a little. Now, as it was announced earlier, they're kind of moving forward with the Back in Time cast, not the original movies that Bryan Singer created with that cast, but they're recasting Jean Grey and Cyclops and Storm. They're using Fassbender and McAvoy as Magneto and Professor X, and that's really the team that they're going with. And a lot of us were sad to see the end of an era with Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart no longer being included. That was the story that broke, and I think we made our peace with it because we were like, you know what, those guys had a good run. I really like what the new cast is doing. The Back in Time cast. And I'm excited to see what they do going forward, and it'll give them more screen time instead of having to run dual tracks. Well, it turns out that story was a little bit, too simplified, and that it's actually a little bit more of an intricate situation. So, what is going on? Well, Ian McKellen, it turns out, is going to be an X-Men Apocalypse. And I think it's because he's just too big a star, and also, personally, he's friends with Bryan Singer. They're very close. Bryan Singer made Ian McKellen a star by casting as Magneto in the first place, so I think that Ian McKellen owes him and is aware of that. And also, I think Bryan Singer probably simply doesn't want to make an X-Men movie without Ian McKellen. So Ian McKellen will somehow be showing up in X-Men Apocalypse. We'll see how they do that. But Patrick Stewart has confirmed yet again, though, that he will not. So I think it's interesting they're only sticking with Ian McKellen, and they're saying so long to Patrick Stewart. I think that's a little bit of a diss, as I think he is just as important in terms of the X-Men movies. Maybe not to Bryan Singer, maybe not even to fans, but I just think in terms of keeping the movies balanced. Because, I think that Magneto and Professor X are a set. But Patrick Stewart isn't out of the X-Men business, as he also revealed that he's been having discussions about appearing in the next Wolverine movie, which would be a team-up movie with Wolverine and Professor X. Now, we talked about time jumping and, having to run parallel tracks in the same movie. Well, maybe, as some of you have said you'd like to see, they're going to keep both timelines going, but they're going to separate them out into entirely different movies. And Wolverine's great for that because, of course, he has such a long life span because of his mutant healing power that he can be in all the different timeline movies. He can skip around and join different casts and keep things fresh, so to speak, for him. And he's the one constant. And I'm sure Fox has no problems with Hugh Jackman being the one constant of their X-Men cinematic universe. But I think it's very interesting to see a Wolverine team up with Professor X. And I hope that this isn't just another situation where Professor X is like, I'm going to be your mutant psychiatrist and probe your mind and then sit in this chair while you go do cool things without me. I don't want to see that again. We've already explored that element. We've already seen Patrick Stewart dig around in people's brains and, give them big revelations as the camera tracks in on him in a close-up. I don't think I want to see that anymore. I want to see Professor X in the field. Have some kind of, doohickey like they always invent in the comics to make him be able to walk. I don't know. Figure it out. Give him a hover chair again. I want to see Professor X in the field. And I just want to see Professor X developed, period. And I think this is something you're going to see happening in the X-Men comics, and therefore probably in the movies. Now, James McAvoy's doing a lot to develop the character with his work, but I think that that's still an early version of Xavier. I really like bald, old-school Xavier as well. And that's what Patrick Stewart embodies. And I think that Professor X can be great in the field. He's a great, really interesting character. And so I would love to see him in a Wolverine movie with him and Hugh Jackman, actually, just the two of them figuring something out, and as I said, going into the battlefield. But what am I talking about with the comics? Well, as I discussed in my episode of Stacktastic last month, it looks like Brian Michael Bendis is bringing back Professor X. Of course, he was killed off in the end of Avengers versus X-Men by Scott Summers, who was possessed by the Phoenix Force. He killed his mentor and father figure, Charles Xavier, and he's been wrestling with that ever since. A great storyline, probably one of the best things to come out of the Avengers versus X-Men whole, a crossover event. But I do think it's time to bring Professor X back, and I think Brian Michael Bendis is just the man to do it. Because I think he's very good at giving characters personality, and not just having Professor X be this figurehead. I think the character suffered from that for too long. He had some good storylines, like, for instance, they never really explored his relationship with Lilandra and the Shi'ar. I think that would be great to do. And also, they've never really delved into what happened between him and Magneto. However, that's being covered by Michael Fassbender and James McAvoy. That isn't something Patrick Stewart's going to get to explore. And I think James McAvoy simply does not want to shave his head. I don't know if he could even pull it off like Patrick Stewart rocks it so well. So I'm curious to what you guys think. Do you think Professor X has untapped potential as a character both on the page and on the screen? Who do you want to see continue to be Professor X going forward? Do you think it's important to keep Patrick Stewart on, or do you want to go full McAvoy? And what do you think of the idea of a Patrick Stewart, Hugh Jackman team-up in a Wolverine Professor X movie? I have not really enjoyed any of the Wolverine movies to date. I think they're moving in the right direction, but still I think they have a ways to go. And this could be something that finally makes it work. All right, so that's the second story of the day. Now the third story of the day, we're going to seg you a little bit into television, but these days, of course, TV and movies cross over so often, particularly when it comes to comic book properties. Now, DC, though, has said that is not the case with their properties. TV and film are separate. But the characters aren't separate. There's only one version of these characters, and as DC continues to use them in different mediums and not divide them up, I think they're creating more confusion. And I was watching Better Call Saul last night. Of course, one of the big news right there, it's the biggest debut ever for a cable television show with like 4.4 million viewers, although I think part of that is because it aired after The Walking Dead, which has amazing numbers itself. But at the end, sure enough, there was an ad for Gotham. Very interesting. I think people, obviously advertisers and other stations knew this would be a big event, Better Call Saul, so they got a lot of important ads on there. And Gotham did not waste its money because they teased the Joker. Yes, that's right. Sooner rather than later, the Joker is coming to Gotham. And I thought it was very interesting in that the imagery they used was from Heath Ledger's version of the character and the very first poster that was released for The Dark Knight, with the Joker standing behind like a cloudy glass pane of glass, like the kind that you see like in a door or something, and drawing the smiley face of the Joker, the Joker's smile with blood. They did this on plastic sheeting, but still the imagery is, unmistakable from what Nolan did with that first poster. And I think that's very interesting, not only to copy that, but to bring the Joker to the small screen so quickly for a show that I don't think needs the character. I think Gotham, it's doing very well in the ratings, especially in DVRs. It's very popular for network television, something that Marvel has not been able to enjoy with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or Agent Carter. Gotham has higher ratings than both those shows right now, and also it's been greenlit for a second season. And I just think it has its fan base, and this is an interesting situation where the fan base is actually, I think, more mainstream viewers, and comic book fans actually aren't. A lot of comic fans don't like Gotham, so you have an inverse situation. And clearly, as you can see, it's better to have the non-comic book fans than the comic book fans because the ratings are stronger. We'll see. Arrow, of course, is very highly regarded though by comic book fans, but still the ratings, because they're the CW, they don't have to be as high. We've discussed this a little bit. I've seen many of you also discuss it in the comments, the difference between network ratings and secondary networks like the CW. But anyway, back to Gotham. So not only are they bringing in the Joker here, which is interesting in and of itself, and they're copying Nolan, which they're supposed to not do. They're supposed to leave Nolan behind, right? That was kind of what the DC and Warner Brothers decided. But I also think it's odd timing considering Jared Leto has to establish this character over in Suicide Squad. So I'm curious to how you guys feel about what this is going to mean for Suicide Squad and Jared Leto's work when they're going to be reaffirming and reestablishing what Heath Ledger developed clearly over on Gotham. Now, of course, nobody can duplicate what Heath Ledger did, so even though they're doing the same with the poster, it'll be interesting to see what the actor they choose does with the role. But still, you're going to have now two Jokers at the same time. You're going to have a Joker on Gotham, and you're going to have a Joker on the big screen with Jared Leto in Suicide Squad. I think that's too big a character to have two versions of. I mean, they're going to be, you could argue they're at different ages, but Jared Leto is a pretty young guy. So unless this Joker on Gotham is like, a high school student, like Scarecrow was revealed to be in this week's episode, I just don't know how this is going to line up. So I'm curious to what you think, if this is a good idea or a bad idea. Are you still on board with DC's decision to separate their TV and movie versions of the DC Cinematic Universe? Or do you agree with me that it's just getting too confusing? I think they're heading towards the edge of a cliff, to go off the edge, but we'll see. I love Gotham, though, and I'm very excited to see what they do with the Joker. Sorry, Jared Leto, you haven't won me over yet, so right now my allegiances are still to that show. All right, so those are the three stories of the day. Let's get to the viewer question, which is from Natalie Aurora. And Natalie Aurora says, question. And I've actually seen a few of you ask me about this, so this is why I picked it. And she says, question. Hi, Grace. I read an article on Yahoo about Frozen and how the movie seems to be anti-male because the villain was a man and how it teaches girls that all men are evil. I wouldn't say that, but it does kind of give the idea that they're inconsequential because they're the villain and they're certainly not the hero either, as Kristoff turns out to be kind of just like, hey, I'm here too. But anyway, as Natalie Aurora continues, she says, although I sort of understand it, I was left a bit confused since for a long time now, men have complained about how guys are being shown as princes and heroes also sends a wrong, unrealistic image of men to young girls. But what does that mean then? If they are the heroes who save the day and it's the girls that's wrong, but if they are the villains, that's wrong also. So, if they save the day and the girl, that's wrong. I'm sorry. So unrealistic image of men to younger. So I'm sorry. But what does that mean then? If they are the heroes and save the day and the girl, that's wrong. But if they are the villains, that's wrong also. So any movie, at least the ones directed by girls, cannot portray males as villains anymore without being seen as anti-male. How about movies where the villain is a female? Doesn't that teach boys all women are evil and shouldn't be trusted? What changes can be done to solve this issue and keep both males and females happy? So also Fox News apparently ran out the story about this, about how Frozen is like anti-male and it's making little boys feel bad. There are a lot of little boys who like Frozen, so I don't know if that's the case. We'll see. But it's an interesting discussion. Now, as some of you have also pointed out, I've talked about this myself. This conversation's been going on for a little bit in the comment section. But I mentioned this in Maleficent, where I thought Maleficent went a bit too far in that it really, again, made men inconsequential. They had nothing really to contribute to the story. And again, they were the villain there as well, with King Stefan turned into the villain of the story. So I had a problem with that, especially because Prince Philip, as I said, was one of the first Disney princesses to actually have something to do. So to see that character sidelined so much in the favor of girl power was unfortunate. This is just called the pendulum effect, though. Everybody who's wondering about this, and it's just natural. It's what happens. There's a knee-jerk reaction when people finally want to break free of a stereotype that's annoyed them, so they go too far in the other direction. But eventually, it all settles down in the middle, and everything's great, and we move forward, and we find another problem to fix. So what do we want it to settle down to? What's the ideal situation? Well, the ideal situation is that you don't have to have people divided up into heroes and villains, that you have male and female characters on both sides of the equation. And I think that's the big problem here. It's not wrong to have a male villain, but when you have no examples of men in a positive light, that's when it becomes problematic, especially because the male villains aren't just being evil, they're being evil towards women and how women and men have relationships, right? Think about it. Hans, this is spoilers, by the way, if you haven't seen Frozen or Maleficent, all right? So when Frozen, Hans uses, Anna wanting to get married against her. He tricks her and makes her think that he loves her and wants to marry her when in fact he wants to take over her kingdom and kill her. So, that's how he's evil. He's not evil as an advancing army. He's evil via relationships between men and women. And the same exact thing happened in Maleficent, where King Stefan was almost like a boyfriend to Maleficent, certainly a romantic interest that was very strongly hinted at. And as many people have said, the scene where he takes her wings is kind of almost a very strong metaphor for date rape, because, he slips her a roofie. And her reaction is certainly one of absolute disgust and being violated. So I think that that's why King Stefan is considered that kind of a villain, where he isn't just evil, he's an evil ex-boyfriend. So I think that that's the problem, first off, that the men are villains in that manner. Men and women fight all the time, but I think to only have them fight in a relationship type situation is the problem. Men and women don't only relate to each other in that way, and as long as Hollywood continues to put that forward, that is the only way they can interact, it's not good for either side. Sometimes men and women interact when there's no romance involved whatsoever, and that's the direction Hollywood should be moving in. Now, the other thing is you have to balance this out. Just if you have a female villain, for instance, also you don't want a female villain who's only using, guys in a romantic situation, right? That would have the same problems. So everything I'm saying applies to both sexes. I don't want anyone to think that this is only the problem with how men are depicted, etc. But that's just who we're discussing in today's viewer question. So on the flip side, you need to have a male character, again, as I said, which shows men in a good light. Like, this guy's a jerk, especially if you're going to have a male villain in the manner I just outlined, where it's through relationships. You need to show that, yes, this is a bad example of a relationship with a guy, but here's a good example. And they are not doing that either. Kristoff, very ineffectual in the Frozen storyline. I mean, he's good company, but that's really about it. And then in Maleficent, there's really no strong male character, period. Prince Philip, he totally he doesn't work at all. He doesn't do what he's supposed to. And then at the end, he's just like, hey, what's up? I followed you to the moors. You want a date? And, it's like, sure, you can be my token boyfriend. You can be my arm candy. And I think that women don't like it when they're turned into arm candy doesn't thought to have any personality or thoughts or hopes or dreams. And of course, men don't like it either, as you would expect. That's the other thing. Men and women might be different. They might be from Mars and Venus, but there's a lot of similarities. Nobody likes to be depicted in certain ways. So I think that you need to have strong male characters that are good, that help out, that are part of the solution. Just like women don't like to be sitting on the sidelines and not help save the day. They don't have to be the only one to save the day, but they want to contribute. It's the same thing for women and for men. For men. And I would also point this out. We've discussed this before. It's the same for any demographic. This isn't just a men-woman discussion. It's also in terms of the different ethnicities out there. Everybody wants to be a part of the team. And Hollywood really needs to keep that in mind when they're crafting their stories. And really they shouldn't just think about what satisfies a certain audience. And this comes from Hollywood's, insistence on only satisfying one demographic per movie. But they really need to put themselves in the audience's shoes and say, well, how would I react to this? And what would be my takeaway? And to keep in mind who goes to the movies together. Women don't go to the movies by themselves. Sometimes we do, but we often go on a date or with our families, with kids, with parents, and often a guy is part of that group. So I think that they need to be aware of maybe while a movie isn't targeting those individuals, they're still seeing it. And what's the takeaway on that? Why be a negative takeaway when you can be a positive takeaway? So that's my answer to your question, Natalie. It's a very complicated situation, but I'm confident that this will be all fixed. But I think part of it being fixed is people actually bringing this up and discussing it. Don't forget that women got this kind of development in their stories because they were loud. I said the other day that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Well, now men really have to step forward and say, hey, I'm glad that you're finally being treated the way you want to in entertainment, but now I don't like what you're doing to me. It's important to bring it up so that the problem can be fixed. All right, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Write down what you think of today's top 3 stories and the viewer question, anything you'd like to see covered tomorrow, any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching. Bye.